starting to regret eating that fast. On your spot. Greetings, Bethany Community Church. We're so glad to have you join us here on our special evening, addressing racism, race, and place in a time of pandemic. My name is Scott Sun. I'm the lead pastor, Bethany North, also the executive lead pastor. And tonight, my other role, most important tonight, is I'm a co-leader of the work called the Ministry of Racial Justice and Reconciliation. Am I right?
I'm Shawnee Scott, and I'm 1/3 of the co-leader team of the Ministry of Racial Justice and Reconciliation. Happy to be here.
And I'm Jonathan Nolasco. I'm on staff at Bethany as the Missions and Outreach Associate, and I'm also a co-leader of our Ministry of Racial Justice and Reconciliation. So tonight we have a special treat. We are joined by Dr. David Leong, and Dr. Leong is a PhD, received degrees from University of Washington, Regent College, and Fuller Theological Seminary. He's currently a professor at SPU, where he oversees the Global and Urban Ministry minor and teaches theological meaning of the city in an increasingly globalized and urbanized world. He's the author of 2 books, Street Sign, Toward a Missional Theology of Urban Cultural Engagement, as well as Race and Place, How Urban Geography Shapes the Journey to Reconciliation. He and his wife and 2 sons live in Rainier Valley and worship at Rainier Avenue Church. Dr. Young loves God. He loves the church. He loves teaching people how racism is outside of God's will and how we have a job to dismantle racism in our city for the glory of God. I was on sabbatical this summer and I picked up this incredible book, Race and Place by Dr. David Leong. And he writes here, the challenge for us as the people of God, and it remains, will Christians follow patterns of exclusion or disrupt them? Will churches reinforce segregation or work against it? He writes, I believe Christian communities, and especially those engaged in urban ministry, have a unique opportunity to practice and model meaningful, lasting reconciliation work. And I thought, this is amazing. And then he writes, but the viability and effectiveness of this work will hinge on much more than idealism, analysis, and rhetoric. As we continue to examine barriers and color lines, I hope our willingness to listen, lament, and engage will also be bolstered by a resolve to act. And so we're here tonight to do all of that, to lament, to listen, to learn, and to be in a posture of humility. We've learned the way forward is from this place on our knees of saying, God, we've missed it, and we want to do better for your kingdom. And there's been a reckoning in our city and our nation around racism. And so tonight, we're here to be learning and to be activated as a Christian community how to dismantle racism. Jonathan, would you pray for our evening?
God, we're grateful for the night. We pray that as you gather your people, that we recognize that you are a God who loves justice, you are a God who desires reconciliation, and yet we confess that in many ways we have rejected your invitation to join you in that work, and so may you have mercy on us, may you forgive us as we seek to be obedient. May you be with us in this event. May you bless David as he speaks courageously and wisely and in ways that may make us feel uncomfortable, but may we learn to receive that. May we listen well, may we listen humbly, and even translate that listening into meaningful action, both as individuals and as communities. God, we pray that this event is just one of the many ways that you continue to move our community, your church, into a closer reality, closer to reflecting your desire for racial justice and reconciliation. Be with us, God. We need you in this work. In your name we pray. Amen.
Well, thank you, Jonathan and Scott, and welcome, Dr. David Leong.
Well, it is a real privilege to be here with all of you. It's really humbling to be invited to share, and also, to be honest, it's a little bit overwhelming to think about this topic in this moment. I've been thinking and praying and turning over in my head a lot of what's really the right message to bring in the short time that we have, given all that's happening in our world and in our city. And if you are like me, then perhaps you have felt a little bit overwhelmed by all that's on our hearts and minds in the wake of a global pandemic that has reshaped so much of our lives. And then, of course, for roughly the past month, in the wake of COVID-19, we are now in the 28th day of the largest and longest protest movement in the United States since the assassination of Martin Luther King. It's a lot to process. It is a lot to handle. And what I wanted to talk about tonight was to try to both address the weight of this moment, but to also talk about a book that I wrote several years ago. And in some ways, if I had known when I was writing this book in 2016 where we would be right now, there are so many things I probably would have said or done differently. And so while I will be talking about the book, I hope to really also spend our time exploring what all this means for us right now. I did want to open my remarks with a short excerpt from a famous letter from Martin Luther King called The Letter from Birmingham Jail, written in 1963. I think it's appropriate for this moment, not only because of the context in which it was written, but also because King's words really capture my heart and my desire for the church to be much more than what it currently is in many ways in this area. Just a little bit of context about this excerpt. Many of you have probably heard of the letter from Birmingham Jail. If you don't know it specifically, many famous quotes from King come from this letter. But I wanted to start with it in part because what prompted King's writing of this letter was actually a letter that he received from a group of white pastors from the area who were responding to King's movement. And they were largely sympathetic to what King had to say, but they asked him to slow down, to dial it back, to kind of ease up on his rhetoric and a lot of his activity. And they asked him to be patient. And they said that the church needed to really abide by law and order and to let King's cries for justice work themselves out in society. And what he said in his critique and response to these pastors, I think, really resonates with me and is appropriate for our moment. So I'll just read these short paragraphs from this letter. He says, in response to these pastors, he says, "I must honestly reiterate that I have been deeply disappointed with the church. I do not say that as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say it as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church, but be assured that my tears have been tears of love. There can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love. Yes, I love the church. I love her sacred walls. I see the church as the body of Christ. But oh, how we have blemished and scarred that body through social neglect and fear of being nonconformist." He goes on later in the letter to say that justice too long delayed is justice denied. The words of King resonate with me because I come as someone who has grown up in the church and has committed much of my adult life to theological education. I love the church, and it pains me to be in this moment to have to talk about all of the ways that the church has fallen short. And so I only wanted to start with this just to say that as we dive into some difficult conversations about race are always hard, but as we bring those conversations to bear on the faithful witness of the church and also the areas where the church has been less than faithful, I hope you can frame this in the remarks of someone who deeply loves the church. So I wanted to jump in and, with that said, start with something that is probably not news to many of you, but it's a reference to our reality of social distance. And I'm taking a bit of liberty with that term to describe social distance not only as a response to the pandemic, but more of a characterizing reality of our different social worlds that we live in, the different political worlds, the different economic worlds. It's to say, in a word, that we live functionally segregated lives that in many ways overlap, but that have resulted in quite a bit of distance from the types of spaces that we inhabit, the homes that we live in, the social worlds that we navigate, and so on and so forth. I just wanted to pick out this one piece of data as an example of this to describe how we are living in a time where we are distant from one another. 538 is a website and publishes a lot of research around data. This is one recent survey they did in the wake of all that's happening in our streets. And they really wanted to know how divided white and black Americans are on racism. There's a whole bunch of data here. I just wanted to focus on one of these first statistics. And it was simply a question about trusting the local police. In response to, do you trust the local police? Thousands of Americans responded, and they boiled this number down to nearly 8 out of 10, 77% of white respondents saying yes, they trust the local police. And 65%, nearly 7 out of 10 black respondents saying no, they do not trust the local police. This and many other data points in this particular study are simply one example, one reminder that we live in different social spaces in which something as basic as how we engage with the police, whether we believe the police are trustworthy and there for us, can lead to very different opinions and outcomes. When we talk about social distance, it's an underlying claim that we'll unpack throughout this evening, that we are living in separate worlds apart from one another, and that's something that the church has to face and engage a little bit further. I'm going to keep going here and try to highlight just a few of the points that we'll look at together. And each of these is a theme and is followed up with a question. And I won't manage our time perfectly, I already know that, but I will try my best to focus on each of these themes and then give us some space to reflect on these questions together. The first one is, as I mentioned earlier, processing the weight of this moment and asking the question if we are listening. The second point is talking about the history that we've ignored and wondering if we will have the courage to face ourselves and to face our own history. And the third is the possibility of reconciliation. In this question, can we imagine and reimagine the people of God? So I'm going to jump right into this first one, the weight of this moment. As I mentioned already, there's a heaviness. I think about how in this moment, as we speak, there are people marching in our own city as these protests and cries for justice continue to echo in our neighborhoods and communities. What I'm really struck by in this passage from the book of Job is this lament around the pain and suffering that we are witnessing. It says, "The groans of the dying rise from the city, and the souls of the wounded cry out for help, but God charges no one with wrongdoing." There is this tradition in the Christian scriptures of lament. And what I want to encourage us to wrestle with in processing the weight of this moment is to ask if we are listening and discerning the voice and activity of the Spirit of God in the pain, anger, and suffering of others. One of my favorite Old Testament scholars named Walter Brueggemann said it very succinctly. He said that the God of Israel is a magnet for human suffering. And so if we want to understand where God is, then we must come alongside people who are suffering. And there we will find a God who has drawn close to people who are brokenhearted. Whether it is the thousands of people who marched in Seattle on Juneteenth, or in the moments of this woman here in the lower corner, Marcia Carter Patterson, the mother of Manuel Ellis, at the intersection of Tacoma where her son was killed. The cries of a mother, the cries of crowds speak to us if we are willing to listen. And I wonder if the church has ears to hear the cries of people who are asking to be seen and to be heard. I think that what's required in this moment for us is both empathy and humility that comes by the transformation of the Holy Spirit. The question of whether or not we are listening is a critical one as we move forward and as we process what it means to pay attention to the activity of God in our neighborhoods and streets. So I wanted to simply begin with the weight of this moment to say, paying attention, listening to God's voice will be critical. And I do think that oftentimes there is a defensiveness or a qualified listening that we offer, and I'm inviting us to consider what might it look like to consider that the cries in our streets and the pain and anguish of people who are suffering may be the voice of God with a word of truth for us. With that said, I'm going to keep going here and to try to move forward into this idea of our history, often an ignored history, but history that is nevertheless still with us. The great author William Faulkner said that the past is never dead, it's not even past. Baldwin very similarly says something that is relevant to our moment. He says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. I want to try to turn our attention to the history of Seattle. And in a lot of ways, we don't have time to do the exhaustive look that I would love to do. So I'm just going to have to paint in some broad strokes. But what I hope to do in looking at this history is to explore both the many ways that the past is present with us, but also the ways that we have resisted identifying ourselves with many of the policies and inequities that have led us to this present moment. So I just want you to pay attention to a couple of things. This map here is a map of the city of Seattle. It's dated 1936. It is a map that is a lot like other maps that were produced at this time. I talk a lot more about the history of redlining in my book. It is not unique research on my part. The history of redlining is not controversial or hidden. It's well documented. It is something that we don't often talk about in the construction of our cities. But the shortest way I could explain it is that it is segregation by design. It is to say that from the point of before World War II moving forward, many of our cities were constructed with racial segregation as a component of enforcing where banks could lend, where people could live, and how neighborhoods would take shape. There is an animation here that may work, and I have overlaid a 2010 map, a census map of our racial distribution on top of this map, just so that you can see how strikingly similar they are from 1936 until today. This racial dot map explains where different populations live in Seattle. The blue dots represent the white population. The red and green dots represent the Asian and black population, respectively. The orange dots, if you can even make those out, are the Hispanic and Latino population. To go back to this redlining map for just a moment and to describe visually what this means for us, it's that basically when we talk about living in separate worlds, it is not only because people have just by chance landed on one side of the city or the other. It is to say that the zip code that you live in is a great determinant, is a key factor in determining what many other points of access are in your life. I want to quote David Williams, who is a public health researcher from Harvard, who says that in the US, your zip code is a better predictor of your health than your genetic code. Where you live determines the quality of housing, of education and healthcare and nutrition. The factors that drive health are powerfully patterned by place. This research is coming on the heels of a widely documented reality that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected communities of color. And if we wonder why that is, we have to look no further than the history that is right under our nose. So it's to say that Seattle, like many other cities, is built upon a structure of racial segregation, and that much of the wealth disparity that we now see in our own city and across cities like it in the US is a direct result of this history of segregation by design. But what does that mean for Seattle? Some of you may be familiar with this data. Others of you are perhaps new to this conversation. I wanted to talk about just a couple of examples of what this segregation looks like in everyday life as we move towards listening and processing if the church has something to say to these realities of segregation. This next slide I have describes a headline from the Seattle Times just a few years ago. Seattle schools have the biggest white-black achievement gap in the state, and on top of that, the fifth worst white and black achievement gap in the entire country, behind the District of Columbia, Atlanta, Charleston, and Oakland. What does this actually mean for us? It means that in many ways you could draw a direct line of connection between the segregation in the housing market, beginning in the 1930s, running through to the present, to the current reality of segregation in Seattle public schools. 60 years after Brown versus Board of Education that called for the legal integration of schools, we are living in a moment when the Seattle public schools, like many other districts across the country, are as segregated now as they were in the 1970s. There's a lot to process here, and that may be news to some of you and not news to others of you, but I wanted to think about what this history means for us. If we draw the line between housing and education, how did this come to be? A little bit more on the locale of Seattle and how this has played out. This is one more headline. I promise we'll move through this history in just a moment here. This is from 2007. And it is about a woman named Kathleen Brose. Kathleen was a Seattle public school mom who wanted her daughter to go to Ballard High School. At the time, Seattle public schools used a policy called the controlled choice system, meaning that in the city of Seattle, parents would elect and write down choices, but they may not get their first choice. Kathleen's daughter, who she had hoped would go to Ballard, was not given her first three choices and was instead assigned to Franklin High School, which is the high school in my neighborhood where I live. Kathleen was deeply upset and disappointed by this reality, and so she formed a group of other concerned parents. She retained an attorney, and she sued the Seattle Public School District, and long story short, over the course of 7 years, took her case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and she prevailed. In 2007, the court ruled in her favor. It was a 5-4 split decision. This interview with Kathleen on the moment of her vindication describes a reality that I think captures in some ways both the ways that our history of segregation is still present with us, but also the ways in which we live in worlds that are so different from one another. I just want to focus on this one excerpt from her interview as she's describing this process. And I'll just say that after this ruling, like dominoes across the country, this Seattle case was a landmark case that after this point, schools all across the country returned to neighborhood schools, meaning that where you lived was where you would go to school. So if you lived in a historically redlined area, that was where you would be assigned to go to school. And so after this case in Seattle, this kind of ruling spilled over to districts all across the country. But I want to focus on this one statement that Kathleen said. She said, "The Seattle schools had never been segregated and were already integrated. The use of this racial tiebreaker was not necessary. Our children just wanted to attend school along with their peers to maintain friendships." I'm going to try really hard to stay out of the weeds of education policy in this moment, and I just want to think about this interesting statement. And I don't want to make this about some sort of character assassination of Kathleen or trying to psychologize her choices or that particular history. I really just want to think about her own words in this interview of saying, the Seattle schools had never been segregated and were already integrated. Kathleen is a smart and educated woman, well-intentioned, wanting the best for her daughter. how could she say something that in some ways is contrary to all of the data that we have, and that in many ways was deeply offensive to the many neighbors and friends and community members where I live in the south side of Seattle, where so many historic communities of color have lived for so long. I want to suggest that the history and the idea that Kathleen supports here is not uncommon at all, but is actually quite consistent with Seattle's history and its inability to face the truth of separation and distance that characterizes so much of our present moment. I want to be mindful of time. I'm going to come back to some of this history in a moment, but I want to leave you for now with just that thought. How is it that Kathleen could make this sort of presumption, this characterization that there was no segregation and no discrimination in Seattle public schools when we know that for 40 years people have been fighting for racial equity and justice in Seattle public schools? A question I would have for Kathleen is, what does her social community look like? And where was the church or Christianity that we have inherited in this country, and in many ways in our city of Seattle as well, is diseased or is tainted with all of the malformations of racial hierarchies? And what he suggests is that we have to reimagine what it means to be the people of God if we're going to consider the possibility of reconciliation. He cautions us that reconciliation is not a given, and that while being a beautiful theological metaphor and something that Christ has accomplished on the cross already, Jennings often cautions his readers to not presume that reconciliation is easy and cheap, and instead he says that it is not at all clear that most Christians in America are ready to imagine reconciliation. First, we must really grapple with the depths of our deformation, and that is revealed so clearly in all the geographic patterns of our history that I tried to explain earlier. I want to read you this quote. There's a lot going on here. I'm just going to read the second half from Jennings' book. He says that we who live in the new space of joining may need to transgress the boundaries of real estate by buying where we should not and living where we must not, by living together where we supposedly cannot and being identified with those whom we should not. For us in the racial world, the remade world, a crucial point of discipleship is precisely global real estate. The story of race is also the story of place. What Jennings is suggesting here is that we need to think differently about what our lives in places look like. We need to come back to the beginning of asking the very basic questions of who is around our table and who is not around our table. Who are those that we identify with? And how is it that much of our social worlds and the separation that characterizes so much of our own city, how is that tied up in who we have imagined God is and who we imagine the people of God to be? We need to broaden our understanding of what is happening as we join our lives with Christ, who has transgressed these boundaries of race and class and gender. So as we consider these different possibilities, I've got about 10 minutes to wrap up with some directions and to try to conclude our time as we move into a time of conversation. These three areas, I hope, will capture some of the practical ways that we can begin to think about what all this means. I know we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the weight of this moment. We've discussed the challenge of facing the difficult truths of our history. And I want to now describe a few places to begin if we want to reimagine the people of God reconciled to one another. The first is this book title I have on the left. A friend of mine named Soong-Chan Rah wrote a wonderful book called Prophetic Lament. It requires listening, this first invitation to listen and lament, is in some ways to become a guest in another community, to learn, to mourn with those who mourn. It's back to what we described earlier, to say, can we presume or can we assume a posture of humility to come alongside in listening with those who in this particular moment are deeply lamenting the painfulness of racial separation and racial inequality in our country? What would it mean to come alongside, not with an eager desire to jump into action yet, but to simply lament and to sit with the difficulty and pain of others, hoping to hear a word from God in that process? Proximity and location is the second point. In my book, Race and Place, I talk a lot about how location is not just your particular home address, but it is all the ways you've located your life residentially and socially and vocationally. There's an invitation to consider the question about what those locations mean for who is distant and who is near. This great book from Brian Stevenson, Just Mercy, describes how in a lot of ways the most practical thing we can do is to become more proximate to people's pain. That proximity is not always easy, and yet in many ways we need to begin by asking ourselves, how have we located our lives in different spaces? How have we thought about our vocations and our addresses and the addresses, God help us, of our churches as well? And what do those locations mean for who is inside of our community and who is estranged from our community? This last point of reflection is about imagination and desire. And I want to end here, and I hope this is something that will sit with you. I hope it's something that you can consider. I'm borrowing a lot of this language from Nicole Hannah-Jones, who received a MacArthur Genius Grant for her work in the New York Times for the 1619 Project, and has done an incredible amount of work around issues of public segregation in public schools. And what she says about her work is something that I think has a lot of poignant parallels to this broader conversation about racial reconciliation in the church. She describes how, as an advocate for racial integration in public schools, she has spent many years in this work, meeting with different stakeholders, going to school and city council meetings. And she says it's very rare that she encounters anyone in the community or in the families that she's engaging with who does not agree with her that integration in public schools would be a good and right thing. She says, though, that there is an important distinction to make between agreeing that something is right and understanding that something is good. Let me say that one more time because I want us to sit with it. That there's an important difference between agreeing with something as right and correct and understanding it more deeply as something that is good. I want to suggest, if you take nothing away from this time that we've had, I know I've tried to cover a lot of information in the short time that we've had, I would hope that you would wrestle with this question of what does it mean to move from this idea that diversity and equity and inclusion and racial justice in our cities and in our churches and our schools and neighborhoods, moving from the idea that this is good and, moving from this idea that this is right and that it's true and it's something we should pursue, to wondering what might it look like for us to examine ourselves and to think about our desires and how we pursue and prioritize and resource the desires that we believe are truly good. Do we believe that a multicultural church is truly a good and beautiful and more desirable church than a monocultural, monoethnic church? Do we believe that we are missing something, potentially a wonderful gift from the diversity of God, by not experiencing that diversity in our communities of faith? I want to close with an illustration that I hope will capture some of this difference between understanding something as right and believing that it is good. I really want to believe in the best that predominantly white churches have to offer to the kingdom of God. I do think that for churches that are predominantly white, there's a recognition of the goodness of what could happen if a broader representation of more cultural groups were present in the community of faith. But I want to draw on this image or metaphor. I'm borrowing the language here of John Perkins, who in describing the different worlds of the white church and the black church says that what has happened in our country, he sometimes describes as a shared wound of oppression. He describes that in the legacy of white supremacy and slavery in our country, he says that no one ever put a chain around another person without the other side of that chain being attached to themselves. He says the wound of black people and black church and black churches in our country is an open wound, a gaping wound for all of us to see, and we're seeing that in our streets right now. But he says the wound of the white church is a hidden wound. It is a wound that is hidden because when we dehumanize another person, what John Perkins describes is that we have also dehumanized ourselves. And the opportunity for mutual transformation is not just one direction of people with resources and power on their side reaching down and helping others. It is a mutual gift of liberation that comes when we recognize the shared wound that has happened between white and black America. I wonder if, as we think about how we can cultivate a deeper sense of imagination, a more honest facing of our desires for what is good, I wonder if we need to come back to that idea of mutuality and mutual transformation, that the gift that we are lacking is in many ways a good gift that God reveals for all to be more fully human and to be in community together as we revisit these painful aspects of our past and of our present. I am almost out of time here. I want to close with perhaps just a humble invitation in many ways as I think about the past 40 minutes or so that we have been together. I'm feeling a little bit like I've missed some connecting points and that I have perhaps jumped around and not connected the dots in a way that makes a lot of sense. And what I would invite you to consider in this journey forward, and my challenge, I guess, to myself and to all of you who are listening and watching, is to not let your journey of learning and exploration end here. In processing the weight of this moment, as I've talked with people in my community, what is so needed in this moment is perseverance and resilience to press forward. I don't know how many more days people are going to be marching in the streets. I don't know how many more years it will take to work for more equity in our housing market and in our public schools. But what I do know is that what the church cannot afford is a simple, momentary, shallow commitment to the work that is set before us. And what is needed is a much longer and resilient marathon kind of preparation for this work. It's going to take all of us working together. It's going to take hard conversations that we're going to have perhaps in just a moment as we transition into a panel. But I just really want to encourage you not to let either the failures of my communication and confusion in this moment or the discomfort that comes from talking about this history to derail the important work that we need to press into together. And my hope and prayer for Bethany is that you would really lean into this work in the coming weeks, the coming months, and the coming years. There's so much goodness in the gifts that God wants to give, and I think if we avail ourselves to listen with humility, to discern the work of the Spirit in our midst, my hope and prayer is that we would continue this conversation and that we would discover the heart and the justice and the beauty of God in the midst of the work that we're doing. So We're going to transition to a time of conversation with a panel. I thank you for your time and attention, and we're going to continue in dialogue.
Thank you, David. We appreciated the way that you've encouraged our church and you have spoke in a way that really challenged us. And so may we take what you talked and allow it to seep into the way that we live our lives, the way we do church. And so now we're going to continue this conversation by moving into this panel portion of our event. And so before we start with some questions we have prepared, feel free to text in your questions. I think that there should be some information. And we're just kind of making sure that the social distancing and the arrangement is all set. So thanks, guys, for doing that. But yeah, feel free to text in your questions, and we'll be moderating that and receiving those. Before we answer some questions, just to introduce ourselves, like I said, my name is Jonathan Nolasco. I'm on staff at Bethany, and you have already met David. But there's two other individuals who are here, and so why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name is Nathan Thomas. My family and I go to Bethany Green Lake, and I'm part of the reason I'm here is because I'm a member of the MRJR Strategic Planning Committee. So I'm one of the many lay leaders that is involved at Bethany supporting this work.
And my name is Silas Sham, and I'm the associate pastor at Bethany Northeast in Lake City.
Great. Thanks, guys. So the first question I think we'll pose for all of us is, how have you personally experienced the intersection of race and place in your own lives here in the Seattle area? Whoever would like to go.
Well, yeah, well, for me, I think out of everyone on this stage, I've been in Seattle the least amount of time. My wife and I, we moved here about 3 years ago from Tennessee. I was there for 10 years. Did undergrad and then grad school and was pastoring in Tennessee. And before that, I'm from Toronto, and then I've lived in France. So my experience of different environments is, it certainly has unique places and intersections as we go to different locations. In Seattle, I would say one of the ways that race and place has intersected with my life specifically has been when it comes to the experience of racism. It certainly has seemed more covert, right? Where I was in Tennessee was pretty overt in the ways that people were not going to hide necessarily their perspectives or views when it comes to my personhood specifically. And one of the reasons we moved up here was to try and be intentional about raising a family in a location that wouldn't necessarily be as hostile. And yet at the same time, my first week here in Edmonds, my first week walking downtown Edmonds, we experienced an event that was clearly based on race, was dehumanizing in many ways, and it kind of broke the illusion that you can't escape it just because you move somewhere else. And at the same time, it shows up in different ways. And I'd say in Seattle, it's a little more covert than overt.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So for me, I think it really surfaced when we bought our house. There's a lot of neighborhoods in Seattle, and there's a lot of disparity between those. Dr. Leong, many for the reasons you mentioned. And so we had a big decision to make when my wife and I decided to buy a home. We wanted, our prior home had been broken into. We wanted a safe neighborhood. We wanted enough space for a growing family. We wanted a yard for kids to play in and good public schools. So we ended up in Lake Forest Park North. But part of the issue is that there are not a lot of black and brown families in Lake Forest Park, which means there's also not a lot of black and brown businesses or culture or restaurants. So there's a lot of big and small things that come from that. If I want to get my hair cut or braids for my daughter or get certain food we like, we have to leave our community. If we want to meet new people and build relationships with people that kind of understand our experiences and where we don't have to constantly explain what it's like just to be us, we have to leave our community. If we want to, show our kids examples of other successful men and women that look like them, we have to leave our community. So another thing is that where we live, because people aren't as used to seeing black and brown people, there's some things we have to deal with. My daughter will come home and complain about kids touching her hair because it's different, or asking her if she's from Africa, and when she says she's from Seattle, they say no, she's not, and she doesn't know what to say because she's 7. Or even myself, walking down the street and having people lock their car doors in my own neighborhood when I walk by their driveway, or seeing two white people walk across the street and pass each other and no issue, but then when they come to me, they cross. Or I remember it was a Sunday at Lake Forest Park Town Center when I was going there early to get some cough medicine for my kids, and I showed up before Rite Aid opened and pulled up at the closest spot right next to a white gentleman who looked over and immediately started his car and drove to the other side of the parking lot. And then 5 minutes later walked all the way across, just inconveniencing himself to be kind of further away. So it's not always the big things. Sometimes it's the little things that kind of just remind you you're different, and that makes people uncomfortable. So we could choose to live somewhere else where we don't have some of those factors, but then we miss out on some of the other things that took us to where we ended up moving. So I think the reality of Seattle for us is it's kind of it's not an and choice. It's have this and this. It's kind of in this or this, and that's kind of the reality that we felt.
David, what about you?
Oh gosh. In a lot of ways, I think I didn't mention this, but obviously I talked about public schools and being a parent with kids in South Seattle public schools on purpose. I will just say that I think after having worked on Queen Anne in North Seattle for 12 years, and when we first had the opportunity to buy a home about 16 years ago, and when we located ourselves in the Rainier Valley on purpose, I think that for a lot of folks, it was kind of met with, when I would describe to people that we moved there on purpose, there was confusion, or maybe, do you know what the schools are like there, or do you know what life is like there? So sometimes I would get this, it was either a look of puzzlement, or the other reaction I would get sometimes was this idea that what we were doing as a family was really noble, that we were embarking on some self-sacrificial journey. And I found both of those responses just really funny. And I would have to correct people and say, like, this is not some personal project or research project. I think I'm still just processing a little bit of what I was trying, I think, a little bit poorly to communicate at the end there. And all I can say is that the gift that South Seattle has been to us has been incredible. And there's nowhere else I would want to live. And while living in the South End for over 15 years has had some challenges, and it's important, I think, to acknowledge that, it has been far and away the most hospitable, the most resourceful. I just can't imagine. I'm so grateful for the gift that community has been to me, and I think that there's just so many misperceptions that people have about different parts of Seattle, simply because maybe of a neighborhood's reputation or something along those lines.
Well, for me, I moved to Seattle a few years ago from Federal Way. And while I had lived in Seattle during my undergrad, I was excited to move to Seattle and really started making my home and feel a sense of belonging in the way I didn't really experience when I was in college. And I moved into North Seattle, and I work here at Bethany Green Lake. And it didn't take long for me to just really realize that, wow, I live in a very majority white context. And that wasn't a shock, but I think coming from Federal Way, which is much more ethnically diverse, that really hit me. And so I began wondering, what does it look like for me to experience belonging in light of being a Latino man in a white majority context? And so I remember a couple years later, I was volunteering with our Kids Summer Adventure Program, which is like our vacation Bible school. And I was leading this group of, I think, about third graders. And we were doing our crafts actually in this building upstairs with some other groups. And the kids were doing their crafts, and I noticed this little boy like looking at me. And he was blonde-haired, fair-skinned, and I had never met him before. And so I looked back at him, and he says, "You're not from here, are you?" And I was really taken aback by that question. And I was like, maybe he's just very curious. Maybe he's just socially awkward. Maybe he's like an undercover ICE agent trying to set me up. I wasn't sure. But I tell him, well, not exactly. Tell me where you think I'm from. And he's like, oh, maybe Spain.
And so I said, well, my parents were born in El Salvador. I was born in California. And I asked him, like, why did you ask me that question? And he says, oh, it's because of your face. And I think I wasn't offended, I wasn't hurt or anything, but I was fascinated by the way that he was able to connect, even at a young age, my appearance with this idea of otherness. And so I'm like realizing that learning to belong in this city will require me to reconcile my Latino identity with kind of the living in a white majority society. And there are ways where I'm so super grateful for the way God created me, and it's not something I'm ashamed of, but it's also something that I have to recognize that whiteness not only labels me as other, but sometimes suspicious and sometimes dangerous in the way that Nathan, you kind of mentioned, this feeling of like, okay, like I feel different. And I really realized this when I was walking around late at night, just kind of walk around my neighborhood. And I used to keep my hands in my pockets. I would wear a hood. Sometimes I would have a flashlight in my pocket. But then I started wondering, like, what if a police officer sees me or a white resident, and what will he think? And will they think I don't belong here? Am I dangerous? What is he doing here? And I started keeping my hands out and taking off my hood and smiling and waving and doing whatever I could to feel or to seem less threatening. And I want to acknowledge that in many ways I have experienced belonging and community and friendship in the city. I believe it's possible. I still desire it. But it's still complicated for a number of unfortunate reasons. And so that's kind of where I'm at, and that's how I try to navigate it. Well, thanks all for sharing vulnerably and honestly. Our next question is, how has your Christian faith shaped your own understanding and experience with racial reconciliation and justice?
So I'll go. So I guess kind of two sides of that. I think as a black man in this country and as a Christian, I think I feel a lot of tension. Because on the one hand, I know, we're called to love our enemies and pray for those that persecute us. But when I see, some of the images that we've been seeing recently and hear stories from my coworkers and family and friends and my own experiences, honestly, that's not my first response, is not to pray for people, right? So there's this tension from knowing that I should be here, but my reality is that I'm actually here. And that tension is very, very evident in a lot of ways in my life. Same way with the way I talk to my kids about what's happening, what I want to say, but also what I also want to say. So that tension is very real. And I guess my hope is that everyone is starting to feel some of that tension now, because I think that tension is a reminder for us that we're not where we're called to be. And that's kind of the first step. It's just kind of what we do with that tension that comes next. The other thing I'll say from another personal story around reconciliation is, so my mother is white, my dad is black. When they got married, it caused a lot of problems. So long story short, I basically grew up without grandparents on my mother's side. Never really had a relationship, saw them every few years. And reconciliation never even had a chance of happening because they were in Ohio, we were in Missouri, and we never saw them. But what I will say is when my grandparents got older and they were actually, we needed to have them live with us to take care of them, like things started to slowly change a bit. When we took apart that separation and when they lived with us, I think when they saw my father for who he is, our family for who we were, there were some real strong tensions there at first. But over time, right before my grandparents passed, they admitted some things around regret and time wasted, and I wouldn't say that we had full reconciliation, but I would say that we had some significant positive steps towards the end, and I don't think that would have ever happened had we stayed separated with them in Ohio and us in Missouri. So I think that's an important lesson. It speaks to exactly what you were talking about. You can't get there if you're separated. So, and that was true of our family.
I think for me, faith is transmitted to us through churches and educational institutions and people. Like, our faith is caught more than it's taught, right? That whole idea. And I grew up predominantly in white spaces. And when I think about what I was taught and what I caught in my church environment about the faith, it was one that didn't explicitly say, we don't value you, everything you bring to the table, Silas. But I think back, like, I never had a Chinese pastor. I have done multiple degrees in theology, never had a Chinese professor. I can think of like two professors of color who were teaching me the faith, right? Giving me my seminary education. And it struck me as you were talking about that comment of saying, when you move down and people were saying, that's noble. This, I think, speaks to the formation in me. Like, I'm a pastor, and my thought when you said you moved down there was, that is noble. Right? That's noble. And in some ways, that's kind of funny because it's talking about, like, my formation as a person of color in the faith is still to have these moments where whiteness as a power structure is working on me, right? So like that distinction between whiteness as pigmentation versus the power structure, and we're talking about the power structure here, right? That's what we're trying to dismantle, so to speak. It's still working on me. And I think when I think about this question, it hits home because the faith I was given is still inundated with a certain view of the world, and I'm still untangling that now.
So I remember that a couple years ago, I went down to Kent to World Relief Seattle's community gardens. And World Relief Seattle is a Christian organization. They work with vulnerable immigrants in our area. And a few years ago, they helped transform this church parking lot into community gardens. And so I drive down there, and I'm among a number of other volunteers, as well as some of the immigrants and refugees who were using that garden. And so I remember listening to the spiel and the introduction about this garden, and it may be because I don't have a lot of experience gardening or I don't eat enough vegetables, but I was not getting all the hype. I was like, I don't know what's so great about this, but I kept that to myself, and I just picked up a shovel, and I dug, and I tried to act like I knew what I was doing. But clearly I didn't, because pretty soon one of the refugees came and he started showing me the correct way to dig and to spread dirt. And he didn't even speak English, but he was motioning me that what I was supposed to do. And so he goes off and helps other volunteers. And when I think about that event, I remember learning more about what's the value of community gardens, what do they really do, and I realized they're more than just providing vegetables for folks, but they can actually be a way that God restores relationships, especially our relationship with the land. And when we think about racial justice through a biblical lens, I think it's helpful for me to see it in a way that racism disrupts and harms our relationship, not just interpersonally, not just with God, but also with ourselves and even with our land. And so I think of this man who is helping me, who was likely a refugee, likely forcibly displaced from his land. He was dark-skinned, and so very vulnerable to the effects of racism. But through this garden, he was able to cultivate and work and make something beautiful and meaningful to his community, and in so doing, contribute to a more meaningful and healthy relationship with his land. And I think that's just helpful when we think about what does it mean to pursue reconciliation, what does it mean to understand racism, is to really recognize the ways that it disrupts the relationship with our land. We see that historically with the Native Americans, and I think that's just a missing piece in often the conversation, and so I'm glad that that's kind of the themes that David has brought up.
I'd love to know what question you've got there. I think that...
Yeah. So we're
I'll try to
now
give it a
taking
stab.
questions from the text in, and I think this is a great question. It says, in the church, how do we normalize these conversations about race and its impact, especially for those who may be earlier in their journey?
Well, as a pastor, I think one thing that we can intentionally be doing, right, to talk and normalize these conversations about race is to, one, be conscious and intentional about who we are platforming, not in terms of like just the speaking that's happening, but also who's informing the sermons and the teachings that we're listening to, right? Like, if all we ever hear are Eurocentric theologians that are going to come at theology in a very particular way with a particular worldview and neglect the global nature of Christianity. I mean, like, over 2 billion plus people identify as Christian all over the world. There's so many other expressions of Christianity that are present. Can we engage in theology in that way, right? Can we allow that to work on us in that way? I think that's one way to start to normalize the beauty of diversity, the gift of diversity present in how we engage in theology, Christianity, and the like.
I'll just say real briefly a couple things. Practice takes a lot of practice. For folks who are, I think for a good reason, timid to engage because they're afraid maybe they'll say the wrong thing, or they're just not sure what to make of this. I mean, race is always a loaded conversation. I do this for a living. I struggled through a lot of that 40 minutes because I was just trying to think about all the different implications. And I think we need to practice more. I think that begins with modeling in leadership. I think it takes humility for leaders to put themselves out there and to make mistakes, to own up to those mistakes when they make them, and to just make it a regular part of the culture of the church, to say this isn't, I think for so long we've thought about these conversations as extracurricular, or it's like it's for the mission committee, or it's for like the social activists or whatever. And I think we're not going to be able to overcome that misconception unless we just practice it more and say like, no, there are ways in which this affects all that we do and all of who we are, because it has to do with our bodies and our identities and our lives. And so I think the more we practice and rehearse it, the better we'll be at kind of bringing others along. And I think what you said about it being caught, I think people will kind of catch on, and you don't have to get a degree and do all the research before you're ready to jump into the conversation. I mean, I think some preparation's always good, like maybe not to jump in headfirst too quick, but I do think it's just that practice and leadership. Yeah.
Well, our second question is, how are multicultural relationships developed without it being or feeling unnatural, strained, or phony?
I don't know if I have a great answer, but one thing I'd say is just look for things that you have in common with people. I mean, whether it's food or sports or children of the same age. But I mean, I think when you look for things that are common, it's easy to make connections with people. I was always a big sports player, but I mean, you put two kids who speak different languages from different places on a field with the soccer ball, and they'll know what to do, right? No one has to tell them. So I think that's a start, is look for things where you have in common versus the differences and try to focus on those. And I think from there, conversations will begin, relationships will start, and that's a thought I have.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, David, you spoke to our staff earlier, and you touched on this question as well, and you can feel free to chime in and add. But what I remember you saying was something that was helpful is that, especially when white people are trying to engage in this work, often what happens is when they really are dedicated to being part of anti-racist organizations and committees and all of that, they find that naturally they come in more contact and meaningful relationships with people of other cultural backgrounds. And so in that way, they're on the mission, they're doing this work, and it doesn't feel like they're tokenizing or just looking for kind of superficial friendships. And I think that's a helpful way of thinking of this. Yes, the diversity, the multicultural relationships matter, but it should be part of a larger mission of really working against racism. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, David, but
No, I think I think as concisely and lovingly as I can, I would ask white folks to do the work in their own communities, right? And that's not the whole of what they should be doing, but I do think that there's just a sense in which white folks need to kind of get their own house in order, so to speak, if they really care about that work. I think sometimes the impulse to I need to find a diverse friend is only going to go down a bad path, right? And what we should do is maybe hit pause and say where does that impulse come from? And do I want to do that because I actually really care about who people are? Or am I trying to follow some instructions or fix something? And so I do think that, one of the more natural ways is for white folks to get together with other white folks to talk about racial segregation in schools or housing or the workplace, and say hey, let's do that work. And as that vocabulary and credibility builds, I think those folks who notice that will come along, and you'll catch their attention.
this has also been my experience, even though I'm not a white person, but I have found that
part of my struggle to find more non-white friends was I was like, man, I live and work in a very kind of white context, and I'm looking for people who maybe share a similar cultural background. And as I'm involved in this work, I find those relationships happening. So I have found that to be true. This question is actually just for David. So what are some of the aspects that would be different if you were to start writing Race and Place in 2020 versus 2016?
Yeah. Well, there's a passing reference. I have a chapter called Walls of Hostility that's a reference to that Pauline text around Christ destroying the dividing wall. I think at that time, Donald Trump was like a candidate, but not even the nominee. I don't want to go down that whole path in this moment, except to say, even as I wrote Race and Place, it's very careful and anecdotal, and I tried to be pastoral, and I try to use a lot of personal examples from my own life and a lot of exposition of Scripture. I think I'm to this point, and it could just be that I've read a lot of James Baldwin in the past couple of years. I think I'm having a sense that there's a greater urgency, and that by being too accommodating and too delicate and too careful can also be a disservice to folks, can also be a way of enabling other folks' fragility. And so I think it's probably a growing edge for me. I don't know what the 2020 version would be like. I think it would go a little harder after naming some of these things up front to say, like, this is the world we're living in, and we are reaping what we have sown, and we don't have a lot of time to drag our feet. So I don't know what that would look like in a more urgent way, but I do think that I think rhetorically it would, I don't know, it would sound, I think it would be more to the point, as opposed to being more careful.
Well, this is our final question for our panel, but I just want to thank everyone who has sent in those questions. Sorry we could not get to all of them, but there will be time, and we'll talk about it more later, to break out into these smaller groups, I think via Zoom, to discuss more. So feel free to hold on to those and discuss those with your community. So the final question is about gentrification. So how do people who are white move into the same spaces, neighborhoods, as our Black, Indigenous, people of color, brothers and sisters, without bringing with us the economic and social woes of gentrification? Easy last question, guys. You got it.
I don't think it's necessarily the fact that you're moving to places that are diverse that's a major issue, right? Like, certainly gentrification will follow with certain socioeconomic elements that come and push out other elements that are locally there, right? But at the same time, like, I think the posture that, David, you were hitting on before is so important to recognize as we come into a community and actually become a fixture within that community. So it's like that difference between how so many times there's this sense of mercy that comes in when churches work in the quote-unquote inner city, right? We're really good at the mercy ministry aspect of it. But like when we were thinking of that Micah text, the do justice, love mercy, walk humbly, like we conflate the justice and the mercy to be the same act without making the distinction where the justice is more Moses saying to Pharaoh, like, let my people go. And Jesus, the mercy is Jesus saying, like, let the children come to me. If you don't do either one of them and you separate them, then you're gonna miss the boat in how you posture your coming into a community with humility. And so being able to do both, I think, is crucial for how you can actually embed and integrate your lives into the lives with other people who are already there.
Thanks, Silas. I think it might be helpful, just really quick. Gentrification, it was a newer concept and idea for me. So I know you mentioned it in your book. You have a whole chapter, actually, in your book. Can you give us like a brief understanding of what that means? So for people who are like, what is gentrification all about?
Yeah, there's a chapter on it in the book. Gentrification is a complex process, but it's driven by economic disparity, and it's about essentially the displacement of people lower on the economic ladder, oftentimes communities of color, when their properties and commercial areas are targeted for redevelopment. And so folks in Seattle would recognize most neighborhoods within the city limits this has occurred to some degree, where economic opportunity ends up pushing out a certain population, and the communities most affected by gentrification are almost always immigrants, refugees, people of color. And so there's an economic incentive, but the power racializes that so that the victims of gentrification are people who have often lived in, the Central District right here in Seattle was the only majority black community in a 5-state region for nearly 80 years. Until beginning in the 1990s, because of its proximity to downtown Seattle, more and more properties started to turn over, and people who had made their whole lives or generations had been raised in this predominantly black community just saw a gradual erasure of their history. And so that's how it works. And now I'm forgetting what the question was.
How I understood it was, how do white people enter into these kind of diverse communities without bringing in all those harms that gentrification brings?
I mean, in some ways, gentrification is so complex from like a cultural and a policy perspective. All I can say is that gentrification can never be stopped completely, but I do think that people of peace, people of goodwill, community-minded neighbors can mitigate its worst effects. And so I think if people are really conscientious about being a good neighbor, then I think we can begin to work against some of the more fast-moving, dangerous aspects of gentrification. I don't think it can ever be completely halted, but I do think that the concerted efforts of organized, thoughtful neighbors, that every neighborhood needs more of those people. And so I don't think that means, I think people should be really cautious in thinking about the resources and weight that they bring into a community that's historically under-resourced. But I don't think that always means like, don't go. So this is the really complicated part. I think sometimes there's lots of reasons to go, and sometimes there's reasons to pause and to say like, maybe that's not my place to move into a community like that. So I don't know. It's complicated. I wish there was more. I could say read the book. There's a little bit in the book about that reality.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, Silas and Nathan and our panelists. I think we're going to wrap up now, and Scott is...
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, gentlemen. As we close, Dr. David just said it, but read the book, Race and Place, because it talks about the racialized history here in Seattle. And I just want to say a few things in closing. Thank you all for tuning in, hundreds and hundreds of you tuning in. Thank you for all the wonderful questions, too many to get asked. And as leadership, we will engage with the questions and seek to find answers to it. Many people asked, how come there weren't more female voices of color on the subject? And if you go to churchbcc.org and go to the page, the Ministry of Racial Justice and Reconciliation, there we outline some of the 5 years of work we've done as a church. And our first 2 all-church speakers were females of color leading this conversation. Our panelists, who were females, weren't able to make it tonight, though we long to have both male and female representation. We wanted you to know that. And Silas touched upon something. One of our facilitator, Taylor Greer in West Seattle, really, we were communicating on the questions, and she said it too. She said, Silas touched on something so important about racialized discipleship. And so this is a discipleship issue, dismantling racism. This isn't a social issue alone. This is certainly not a political or partisan issue. It's a discipleship issue. It's why Bethany is coming out strong right now to say, as disciples of Christ, this question of who is my neighbor? How do I practice hospitality? What does it look like to let the gospel live in me, the Spirit of God? How do we do this work? We do it as Christian disciples. So it's why the church is standing so strong on this now, as well as humbly saying we want to do better, and the work will continue. That's what we're going to do right now. You're invited in 5 of your 6 locations. There's a conversation about to take place as soon as Shawnee closes us with prayer. On the screen right now, you see the bit.ly interaction of where you can find your location-specific Zoom link. These are led by people from your Ministry of Racial Justice and Reconciliation and your local pastors. You can also go into the chat to find the links for where do I go if I worship at Green Lake, where can I find that? So those links are up and you can go. Please do. We know it's getting late. Please take this next step to say, hey, as a congregant in West Seattle, on the east side, here at, Green Lake, at Bethany North, I want to go deeper with this work. I want to engage. Also would strongly encourage you to stick around so that your pastors can see who's engaging in the conversation. We need new voices. We need new people to help us see what we don't yet see, to engage these conversations about race and place. It's what we desperately need to continue the work. So stick around and log on to those location-specific Zoom meetings. All the information is online. Again, thank you so much for a wonderful evening. Shawnee?
Thank you, Scott. I have a hunch that all of you are joining me in feeling this is a come to Jesus moment. And we've gotten a fire hose of speaking and words and thoughts and ideas. And I want to just pause by taking just 1 minute. Join me in prayer together. We're going to ask God, what is the one thing you were saying to me this evening? And then I'll close. God, what is the one thing you're saying to me this evening? God, we're asking you that because we are fully dependent upon you to transform our hearts as we listen tonight to your words, to your truth spoken through Dr. Leong and all these other brothers. God, you've asked us some really piercing questions tonight. Are we listening? Are we listening in the weight of this moment? God, we need and we ask for your empathy and your humility to listen. God, you've asked us, will we face ourselves? What if this is who we really are? God, give us the courage and humility to lean into truth, to face ourselves. And God, you've asked us if we can reimagine the people of God, reimagine ourselves reconciled to one another. It's not cheap, it's not easy. We saw what it cost you on the cross. And it's no less cheap for us. So God, strengthen us and equip us and encourage us to listen and lament, to think about how we locate ourselves presidentially, socially, and vocationally. God, move us toward people who are in pain. And God, finally, as part of our transformation, we pray that through your Spirit, we would grow and be impassioned to do this work of dismantling racism, not just because we know it's right. It is right. But God, because we know it's good. It's good. It's your good kingdom. It's your good plan. People from every tribe, tongue, and nation all together in your house. It's your very good gospel, and that's why we want to do it. Thank you. We love you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks for coming. Tune into your local Zoom meetings happening now. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks.